fair way of doing well. Now, these stories about dancing sheep and song-singing hogs and absurd trials by scales and water, the deranged tongue roaster, the crackpot china breaker, the lunatic self-made castrato, they have to make us think that the believers are candidates for bedlam. Moreover, when we're told that the witches outweighed Moses and all the prophets and apostles, it's impossible not to think of all the miracles depicted in the Bible, which, if they were described as having happened yesterday, would be written off, at least by rationalists and even by many believers, as frauds or the ravings of foam-at-the-mouth lunatics. That's very close to what Hobbes, following Bacon, did say about religious enthusiasm. But for all of his rationalistic mockery of such enthusiasm, crazed enthusiasm, Franklin was the publisher and lifelong friend of the New Light evangelist George Whitefield, who was a preacher whose power to bring foam to his listener's mouth was well known. He is said to have addressed, without any help, crowds of 20,000 people, where half of them would be falling down and fainting on the ground, and he was really a fire and brimstone guy. And he was a very good friend. In fact, Franklin as a publisher only made more money selling the autobiography than he did the sermons of George Whitefield. He made a fortune selling his sermons. But perhaps more important, in 1730, Franklin published another hoax about religion that has an altogether different and really quite interesting twist. The hoax takes the form of two letters. He did this all the time. He wrote himself letters as to the editor. Franklin wrote to Franklin, and then Franklin would reply to Franklin. It's all like puppets. So it takes the form of a letter written to the editor of the Gazette asking for advice about a spiritual matter. The writer opens by noting that the age they live in abounds with freethinkers and followers of Spinoza and Hobbes, who despise revelation and deny the existence of spirits in general and the devil in particular. The writer was convinced by these freethinkers. He had become a freethinker himself, and he had no fear of demons and hobgoblins. But then, something happened. Can you hear in the back? The writer was convinced by these freethinkers and had no fear of demons and hobgoblins. But then something happened that changed his mind. He met a perfectly sober and honest reverend gentleman who told him a story of the miraculous appearance of the devil. The reverend and some colleagues had met in town to discuss measures for preventing the spread of atheism. After the meeting, they stayed the night in a hotel, where they were tormented when they went to bed at 10 o'clock by the beating of a drum that no one else in the establishment could hear. The devil was at work against these crusaders against atheism. The reverend's story convinced the previous free-thinking writer, who switched and became a believer in spirits. But then his newfound faith in spirits was staggered by two additional events. First, it was pointed out to the writer that the German divines say that the devil does his work after midnight. Couldn't have been at 10, and not earlier, as described by the reverend. Second, the same man related to the writer a story about a drunken preacher called from a pub to serve at a funeral. When in the course of the service the soused preacher said, "I heard a voice from heaven," the preacher's equally soused drinking companion, who had come along for the service, yelled out, "By God, that's a damn lie. For I've been drinking with you all day at Mother So-and-so's, and if you had heard the voice, I should have heard it too, for my ears are as good as yours." In the light of all this, says the writer, should he still believe the reverend? That's the end of the first half of the hoax. He's asking, who do I believe? Next day, 2 days later, Franklin sent the second to himself under the pen name Philo-Claris, friend of the clergy. In the guise of Philo-Claris, Franklin takes the Gazette editor himself to task for printing an obvious spoof of believers, and the clergy who lead them. Even a non-believer should know better than to mock the clergy, Franklin says to himself, given the support provided by the clergy for virtue and morality, without which society couldn't last very long. But then, Franklin has Philo-Claris make a very surprising move. As regards the intervention of spirits in our lives, Philo-Claris, i.e. Franklin, says, besides, as far as we know, there is nothing impossible in the thing itself. We cannot be certain there are no spirits existing. It is rather highly probable that there are. But we are sure that if spirits do exist, we're very ignorant of their nature, and know neither their motives nor methods of acting, nor can we tell by what means they may render themselves perceptible to our senses. It doesn't sound like a raving lunatic. And then it gets even more extraordinary. Now, to set the stage for this, you have to understand that Hobbes stated the classical rationalist position on the matter of spirits and miracles in chapter 12 of the Leviathan, of his famous book on the foundation of politics. According to Hobbes, belief in spirits springs from men's fear of unknown causes, especially the unknown causes of their good and bad fortune, about which they live in perpetual anxiety. Since this fear must have an object, and since the object cannot be seen, quote, there is nothing to accuse, either of their good fortune or evil fortune, but some power or agent invisible. Now, as to what these agents are, he says of the people who imagine them, they could not by natural cognition fall upon any other conceit, but that it was the same as the soul of man, and that the soul of man was of the same substance with that which appeareth in a dream to one that sleepeth, or in a looking glass to one that is awake, which men, not knowing that such apparitions are nothing else but the creatures of the fancy, think to be real and external substances, and therefore call them ghosts and think them spirits. So you see, you're facing a looking glass, and these fools think there's somebody there. And there's not, there's just a reflection of me. Okay? And the same thing goes for people who see things in dreams. They think they've seen something and then they believe it's real. And so Hobbes is claiming that people out of fear imagine these hobgoblins and blame them for their good or bad fortune. Hobbes concludes that the idea of an incorporeal spirit is just a combination of words of contradictory signification, of which men can never have the imagination of anything answering to them. Okay? So there's no such thing because they're figments of the imagination. Now, after his sober opening comments about the possibility of spirits, in direct sort of anticipatory objection to Hobbes, Philo-Claris responds precisely to Hobbes' argument. Those, he says, who have contemplated the nature of animals seem to be convinced that spirit can act upon matter, for they ascribe the motion of the body to the will and power of the mind. Anatomists also tell us that there are nerves of communication from all parts of the body to the brain, and philosophers assure us that the vibrations of the air striking on the auditory nerves give to the brain the sensation of what we call sound, and that the rays of light striking on the optic nerves communicate a motion to the brain which forms there the image of that brain from which those rays were reflected. We find, says Philo-Claris, that a blow on the eye creates a sense of light. Just poke yourself in the closed eye, you'll see a flash, which no one else can see, where there is none. And I can see it. There's nothing out there, but it's in here. Okay? And this is what Hobbes calls an apparition, but it's real. You can make it happen to yourself. And then he concludes, now, how can we be assured that it is not in the power of a spirit outside the body to operate in a like manner on the nerves of sight, and give them the same vibrations as when a certain object appears before the eye, though no such object is really present, and accordingly make a particular man see the apparition of any person or thing at pleasure, when no one else in company can see it. Thus could a person hear the spirit or the voice of God, and thus could a person become inspired. So Philo-Claris has given us a lot that we need for a response to Hobbes if we're inclined to give one. At the very least, the believer could say that we all experience all the